A pale morning mist drifts across the flat lands of Suffolk, softening every shape, dissolving edges, and turning the horizon into a wavering line where earth and sky seem to negotiate their boundaries. On a narrow country road bordered by heather and wind-bent grass, a set of colossal gates appears without warning, as if materializing from the fog. They rise from the landscape with an authority that feels almost theatrical, guarding something that should not logically stand in this quiet corner of England. Beyond the gates stretches an unbroken wall of ancient trees, their branches intertwined so densely that even daylight hesitates to enter. This hidden expanse is known among locals by a name spoken half in jest, half in reverence: the sleeping giant. For generations, the giant remained silent, closing itself off from the world as though protecting a memory too heavy to share. Travelers passing by would see nothing more than those stern gates and the impenetrable forest behind them, never suspecting that deeper inside lies a structure that bends the very rules of architectural reality. Its story begins with a contradiction. The place appears stubbornly plain from the outside, a long sweep of red brick that hints at nothing more than an old English manor designed with restraint and a faint air of monotony. Yet something in its stance feels off, as if the house is deliberately hiding its true face behind the simplest mask it could find. The closer one approaches, the stronger this tension grows. The building seems to retreat behind its own facade, as though waiting for permission to reveal a secret. There is no warm glimpse of a lit window, no gentle curves of a familiar countryside estate, only straight lines, rigid geometry, and the kind of silence that suggests the land itself is holding its breath. It is a house that should have been predictable, almost forgettable, and yet forgetting it is impossible. The mind senses an unexplained depth, a discrepancy between what the eyes see and what intuition whispers. That contradiction becomes undeniable the moment the heavy oak door swings inward. Instead of the expected shadows of paneled halls and portraits of distant ancestors, the interior overwhelms the senses like a sudden burst of sunlight in a darkened theater. England disappears the instant you cross the threshold. The air changes, the light changes. Even sound behaves differently. The walls open into vast arches carved with patterns too intricate, too delicate, too foreign to belong here. The space breathes with a rhythm that belongs to another continent altogether, a world of domes, marble, and ornamentation that feels almost impossibly out of place. Nothing prepares the visitor for this dissonance. Outside stands a disciplined English manor. Inside unfurls an echo of Indian palaces, as though a fragment of Punjab had broken off and drifted across continents to take shelter in the Suffolk countryside. The effect is not polite or subtle. It is a shock, an intentional rupture in expectation. This is not a home built to impress with lineage or tradition. It is a proclamation of longing, ambition, and defiance wrapped in stone. And the realization strikes immediately. Whatever happened here, it could not have been ordinary. The deception of the facade suddenly becomes clear. The exterior was never meant to reflect reality. It was a mask, one that concealed a story powerful enough to fracture a building into two identities. The house stands like a riddle constructed by someone who refused to choose between two worlds, someone who believed that beauty and belonging could be rebuilt from memory alone. And as the first glimpse of that hidden world fades into the swirling light of the hall, one unavoidable question rises. Who created this impossible paradox? And why did they bury it behind the quietest facade in England? This question does not linger unanswered for long. The deeper one steps into the heart of the giant, the clearer it becomes that the house did not appear through chance or whim. It was shaped by people whose lives were larger than the walls they built, and by ambitions fierce enough to alter landscapes. The facade may lie, but the stone remembers. And following the trail of those memories will lead to the moment when the sleeping giant first opened its eyes. The first impression of the house is built on pure misdirection. From the roadside, it appears orderly, disciplined, almost conservative in its simplicity. Rows of red bricks stretch across the facade, with the calm certainty of a typical Victorian manor, the kind that promises dark wooden corridors, modest parlors, and a steady, predictable history. Nothing in its outward design hints at turbulence or imagination. It looks like a place where nothing extraordinary has ever happened, where every room should smell faintly of old books, beeswax, and quiet English routine. Yet the stillness feels too deliberate, as if the building is performing a role it never fully believed in. The longer one studies this facade, the more peculiar it becomes. The symmetry is precise, almost excessively so, as though someone was determined to erase any trace of personality from the exterior. The windows are evenly spaced, the brickwork immaculate, the roofline exact. It is a mask perfected through restraint, a structure so understated that it crosses into the realm of deception. The house seems to whisper, "Look away. There is nothing here worth noticing." And yet, for reasons that defy logic, it compels the observer to look closer. Something about its posture suggests that the real story hides not in what is shown, but in what is suppressed. This illusion collapses the moment one crosses the threshold. The familiar language of English architecture dissolves instantly, as if the house grows impatient with its own disguise and tears it off the moment a guest steps inside. The shift is abrupt, almost disorienting. One second you stand before modest brick walls, the next you are confronted by soaring arches, luminous surfaces, and the whispered echoes of faraway lands. It feels as though the interior had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal itself, releasing a burst of color and form so vivid it erases the memory of the exterior in an instant. The contrast raises a question that demands an answer. Houses do not create contradictions by accident. A building does not mimic an English manor on the outside, while harboring an entirely different universe within, unless someone deliberately shaped it that way. The deception is intentional, and the purpose behind it must be rooted in a story powerful enough to bend architecture into contradiction. Somewhere in the origins of this house lies the key to understanding how two worlds were forced to coexist under one roof. As the visitor adjusts to the change in atmosphere, the facade becomes more than a design choice. It becomes a metaphor for the life of the person who commissioned it. The outer shell clings to English tradition, but the interiors pulse with longing for a homeland thousands of miles away. Only a creator torn between identities could have conceived such a structure. The house becomes a testament to that internal struggle, a physical embodiment of a life split in two. That realization leads inevitably to the figure who first imposed this double nature upon the building. The red brick exterior whispers of conformity, assimilation, and the pressures of a new world. The interior shouts of memory, imagination, and a desperate attempt to reconstruct something lost. To understand why the house contains this fracture, one must step back into the era when an exiled ruler stood on this land, determined to carve a fragment of his past into the quiet soil of Suffolk. He arrives in the English countryside as a young man carrying the weight of a life that had once belonged to palaces, crowns, and ceremonies far removed from the quiet fields of Suffolk. Duleep Singh, the boy ruler taken from his homeland and reshaped by an empire that expected gratitude instead of grief, steps onto this land with a longing that has followed him across continents. The estate he acquires is ordinary, almost unremarkable, a place with no reason to stand out among the many country houses scattered across England. Yet in his eyes it becomes a canvas, one broad enough to hold the fragments of a world he lost too soon. The transformation begins not with fanfare, but with a kind of urgency. He does not try to adapt the house to England. He tries to adapt England to his memories. Each architectural decision he makes pulls the structure farther from its surroundings and closer to the palaces he once knew. He invites artisans capable of shaping plaster into delicate vines, geometric patterns, and symbolic motifs that recall the Mughal traditions of his childhood. The ceilings bloom with ornamentation. The arches stretch and curve with a rhythm that defies the rigid lines of the exterior. Step by step, room by room, a vision takes form. A dream transported into a place where it does not logically belong. The more the interior evolves, the clearer it becomes that this is not a simple renovation, but an act of emotional construction. The house grows into an attempt at reclaiming something intangible, a sense of belonging he had been asked to forget. Within these walls he rebuilds what the world had taken from him, not in the dramatic scale of his former kingdom, but in the intimate language of personal memory. The result is an extraordinary fusion, an English manor wrapped around an Indian heart, as if the structure itself were trying to protect a part of him the outside world refused to acknowledge. Yet the project carries an undercurrent of fragility. The magnificence of the new interiors cannot hide the fact that their creator is a man caught between worlds, unable to root himself fully in either. What he builds is beautiful, but it also reflects the tension of a life reshaped by forces beyond his control. The house becomes both sanctuary and reminder, a place filled with echoes of a homeland he cannot return to, and a society he is expected to adopt as his own. His vision moves forward with determination, but it is also clear that something essential remains unresolved. As time passes, the dream begins to lose momentum. The palace he is crafting inside the English countryside remains incomplete, not because he lacks imagination, but because the life surrounding him refuses to settle. The estate stands half transformed, half yearning, as though it is waiting for a new chapter to determine what it will finally become. The walls he reshaped hold his story, yet they also carry a sense of anticipation, as if the building itself knows that its evolution is far from finished. The illusion he created remains suspended in this delicate state when he eventually leaves the estate behind. His departure does not erase his influence. Instead, it leaves a lingering question in the air. The house now contains two identities bound together without resolution. And into this unfinished world, another figure will soon step, someone whose ambitions are vast enough to take the Maharaja's dream and redirect it into a completely different destiny. When the Maharaja's presence fades from the estate, the house enters a silence so complete it feels physical, as if the very air thickens in his absence. The transformation he began remains suspended, unfinished corridors of ornament, ceilings that bloom into patterns without spreading fully across the room, arches that seem to wait for a guiding hand that never returns. Elveden becomes a hybrid caught halfway between two worlds, an English shell that carries the faint pulse of an Indian dream. Without its creator, that pulse weakens, but it does not disappear. Instead, it lingers like a quiet echo trapped in marble and plaster, a reminder that something extraordinary once unfolded within these walls. The land surrounding the house grows still. The once active courtyards fall quiet, the rooms lose the warmth of footsteps and lamplight, and the architectural experiment, brilliant yet incomplete, settles into an uneasy rest. The building feels watchful, suspended in a state that is neither abandonment nor fulfillment. Its outer facade remains stiffly English, but the interior, shaped by longing and memory, now seems almost too vivid, too delicate, without the imagination that breathed life into it. The contrast deepens rather than softens. The house becomes more mysterious, more enigmatic, as if its dual identity is now exposed without anyone to explain it. People passing along the narrow road sense the change without knowing the details. The estate begins to acquire an unspoken aura, something between melancholy and expectation. Elveden does not feel like a relic. It feels like a paused story. Its walls are filled not with decay, but with anticipation. The Indian-inspired halls, deprived of their creator, appear frozen mid-sentence, as though the next chapter refuses to begin until someone with equal force of will steps forward. The place does not decline, it waits. Inside, the rooms hold on to their last moments of life. Fabrics, carvings, and ornament retain the intensity of their original purpose, but the absence of daily activity gives everything a strange clarity. Without voices, without motion, the interiors reveal themselves more boldly. The house stands almost defiant, guarding what remains of a dream that had never been meant to coexist with the soil of Suffolk in the first place. Its quiet becomes a kind of challenge, an architectural riddle daring someone to unravel it. This suspension becomes the estate's defining quality. It is neither a palace nor a manor, neither fully Indian nor fully English. It is a structure without a finished identity, shaped by ambition, yet left in limbo. And within that limbo lies the question that turns the stillness into tension. Who will dare to step into this half-formed world and attempt to complete it? Who will have the imagination or the audacity to take a house built from exile and transform it into something capable of surviving in a country that never understood its creator? The answer is approaching, though the house has no way of knowing it yet. Beyond the quiet fields and hidden gates, someone is already rising whose vision will collide with the Maharaja's unfinished dream. Elveden's stillness is temporary. The giant is waiting, and soon another force, powerful, strategic, and entirely different in spirit, will cross its threshold and reshape its destiny forever. He arrives not as a dreamer seeking solace, but as a strategist assessing an opportunity. Edward Guinness steps onto the estate with the measured gaze of a man who built fortunes by understanding leverage, financial, social, and symbolic. The house before him is still wrapped in the remnants of the Maharaja's imagination, a strange jewel embedded in English soil, impressive yet incomplete. Most men of his status might have dismissed it as an eccentric relic. Edward does not. He studies the structure the way a general studies a battlefield, searching for the advantage hidden beneath the surface. To him, Elveden is not merely property. It is a stage, a place where influence can be cultivated with precision, where the quiet rituals of the British elite, hunting parties, political gatherings, whispered negotiations, can be orchestrated on his terms. He sees immediately that the house is unlike anything owned by the aristocracy he intends to surpass. Its dual identity, so problematic for others, becomes for him a powerful tool. The Indian interiors speak of exotic splendor, the English exterior of social conformity. Together, they form a platform upon which he can demonstrate both wealth and imaginative reach, qualities that old families may mock in public but secretly fear. Yet the house, in its current form, is not enough. For a man whose brewery empire spans continents, for someone accustomed to maneuvering through London's financial world with bold, calculated moves, the existing structure feels constrained. It is magnificent in places, but its scale is mismatched to the ambitions he carries. He does not intend merely to host guests. He intends to dominate the social landscape, to create an environment so impressive that even royalty cannot ignore it. As he walks through the Maharaja's unfinished halls, he recognizes beauty, but he also recognizes limitation. The dream of an exiled ruler is captivating, yet it lacks the infrastructure, the grandeur, and the strategic layout required to support gatherings of the scale he envisions. The rooms are evocative but intimate, designed for memory rather than spectacle. The overall structure feels like a prelude, a remarkable introduction with no proper second act. In this realization, a new destiny for Elveden begins to form. Edward does not see the house for what it is. He sees it for what it could become when shaped by resources unmatched in this region. The quiet halls, the carved arches, the glowing marble, they are not endpoints but foundations. His mind recalibrates the estate, imagining wings extended, ceilings raised, corridors lengthened, and entire areas rebuilt to project an impression of power that rivals the palaces of established nobility. What draws him in is not nostalgia or admiration, but potential. The house offers a rare combination, an exterior respected by English tradition and an interior that hints at a world beyond Europe. With the right enhancements, it could become a masterpiece of social engineering, a place where monarchs feel at ease and aristocrats feel compelled to acknowledge the authority of a man whose influence comes from industry rather than ancestry. To Edward Guinness, Elveden is not a dream preserved, but an unfinished empire awaiting completion. His ambitions stretch far beyond the boundaries of the estate, but he understands something essential. Every empire needs a symbol. This house, with its fractured identity and dramatic possibilities, could become that symbol, if he dares to reshape it entirely. And so, the sleeping giant acquires a new architect of destiny, one whose vision is bolder, sharper, and far more expansive than anything the Maharaja attempted. The house stands at the threshold of its most dramatic transformation yet, poised to evolve from a personal refuge into a monument built on power, precision, and performance. The decision to purchase Elveden was not born from sentiment or aesthetic admiration. Edward Guinness chose this place with the precision of someone accustomed to viewing land not as scenery, but as a network of opportunities waiting to be activated. The estate's most valuable asset was not the house itself, at that time still a curious hybrid of unfinished Indian splendor and English modesty, but the vast territory stretching far beyond its walls. These lands were famed for their wildlife, particularly pheasant and partridge, and in the social mechanics of the late Victorian elite, such hunting grounds functioned as far more than a gentleman's pastime. They were gateways into circles where alliances were formed, favors exchanged, and influence negotiated with the subtlety of a well-placed gesture or a shared afternoon in the field. The British monarchy often moved through these landscapes, seeking escapes from the rigid formality of palace life. For Edward, this presented an opening. Hosting royal hunts was not a hobby. It was a strategic maneuver. Where others saw countryside leisure, he saw a chance to place himself at the center of conversations that shaped the empire. Elveden's location, its expanses of woodland, and its reputation among sportsmen positioned it as the perfect arena for cultivating the recognition he sought from the highest ranks of society. Yet land alone was not enough. If the estate was to serve as a conduit to power, it needed to operate flawlessly, as efficiently as the brewery empire that had made him one of the wealthiest men in the world. He viewed the grounds the way he viewed his factories, systems that must be optimized. He expanded the borders of the property, acquiring neighboring parcels until he controlled a staggering sweep of territory. Under his guidance, gamekeeping became almost scientific, with careful breeding, feeding, and land management that transformed the estate into a pristine environment engineered for success. Even the forests seemed to fall into line, reshaped to create ideal sightlines and pathways for the hunts that would bring the elite to his doorstep. But these developments only set the stage. The house itself, the centerpiece of any gathering, the architectural symbol of the host's stature, was still inadequate for Edward's ambitions. Its interiors, influenced by the Maharaja's longing, were intimate and evocative, but not suited to the scale of events he planned. The spaces were too cramped for royal entourages, too delicate for the heavy machinery of political theater. The building had charm, but charm was not the currency Edward sought. He needed something that commanded attention, something that declared its importance the moment a guest crossed the threshold. This gap between what the house was and what he needed it to become sharpened his vision. Elveden could no longer exist as an eccentric fusion of cultures. It had to transform into a fortress of influence, a residence so compelling that declining an invitation would be unthinkable. Its halls had to accommodate crowds, its guest suites had to rival those of royal palaces, and its central spaces had to project the confidence of a man who could bend old aristocratic traditions to his will. There, within that gap, a new strategy took shape. The house would not be expanded casually or decorated in fragments. It would be reinvented, reimagined, elevated into a marvel capable of holding the gravitas of royalty and the calculated showmanship of a man determined to reshape his social destiny. The scale of the transformation he envisioned far exceeded renovation. It bordered on architectural conquest. And as this idea solidified, Elveden began to shift in Edward's mind from an asset to a mission. The estate would become the physical embodiment of his ascent, a place where the old elite would be forced to acknowledge the power of new money when wielded with intelligence and precision. The house, still quiet and incomplete, stood on the edge of the most transformative chapter in its existence, awaiting an overhaul so vast that it would erase nearly everything familiar about it and replace it with a vision engineered for grandeur. The sleeping giant was about to awaken again, this time under the guidance of a man who intended not to honor its past, but to redefine its future entirely. The more Edward walked through the rooms shaped by the Maharaja's imagination, the more the house revealed its limits. What had once felt like an extraordinary interior now appeared restrictive under the weight of his plans. The ceilings were too low for the crowds he intended to host, the corridors too narrow for the seamless movement of attendants, and the reception rooms too intimate for the scale of gatherings he envisioned. The estate itself was vast, but its architectural heart was undersized, like a finely carved jewel placed inside a box never meant to hold it. For a man who measured success in expansion and influence, this mismatch was impossible to ignore. The problem was not aesthetic, it was structural. The house had been designed to reflect the inner world of a displaced ruler, not the public life of someone determined to reshape social hierarchies. Edward needed a setting capable of supporting political conversations, whispered over brandy, royal visits that required dozens of staff, and hunting parties that brought together the most influential figures of the era. The estate could provide the grounds for sport, but the house could not yet provide the theater for power. Every wall seemed to press inward. Every room reminded him of constraints he refused to accept. This tension between ambition and architecture crystallized into a moment of clarity. If the house was too small, then it must grow, not through modest additions, but through a transformation so extensive that the entire building would shift in meaning and magnitude. Edward approached the estate the way he approached every major venture of his life, by envisioning it on a scale that felt almost unreasonable to others, but perfectly logical to him. He saw beyond the existing brick, beyond the plasterwork, beyond the ornate memories left by the Maharaja. He saw a future structure capable of impressing royalty, unsettling rivals, and showcasing wealth without apology. The house required not merely expansion, but reinvention. Its new role demanded spaces that could handle grand entrances, sweeping receptions, and the movement of dozens of guests at once. Diplomatic encounters required quiet antechambers. Royal visits required luxurious suites, and large-scale gatherings required halls that could stun the eye in a single glance. The existing layout could not deliver any of that. What Edward envisioned would have to be built almost from scratch, a monumental extension capable of reshaping not only the building's appearance, but its entire identity. This realization marked the beginning of a new era for Elveden. The estate, once defined by the delicate, inward-facing dream of an exiled king, was about to be thrust into the realm of outward performance. The modest English facade would soon mask an internal landscape engineered for spectacle. The scale of change required was so immense that no ordinary architect would suffice. Edward needed someone capable of merging tradition with audacity, someone who could stitch together two architectural worlds without losing the essence of either. The decision to expand the estate did more than shape the house. It signaled a turning point. Elveden was no longer just a property. It was a declaration, a statement that the ambitions of a brewing magnate could outgrow the limitations imposed by centuries of English hierarchy. As the plans for expansion began to form, the house seemed to react, as though aware that its quiet existence was ending. The walls that once held the intimate echoes of the Maharaja's memories now braced themselves for a future defined by grandeur, precision, and scale. When William Young arrived at Elveden, he encountered a building suspended between two visions, neither of which had yet reached their full expression. Edward Guinness presented him with a challenge unmatched by any conventional commission. Preserve the dignity of an English manor from the outside, yet elevate the Indian-inspired interior into a masterpiece capable of overwhelming even the most seasoned aristocratic guests. This was not a renovation, but an invitation to create a new architectural language, one that stitched together two civilizations without allowing either to dominate the other. Young approached the task with the seriousness of someone aware that he was shaping a monument, not merely a residence, and his designs began to reimagine the estate with a scale and ambition worthy of the ambitions behind it. The exterior became the first canvas. Young extended the house with new wings that mimicked the quiet discipline of the original red brick facade, ensuring that the building would continue to communicate stability and respectability to anyone viewing it from the drive. The symmetry remained intact, the roof lines disciplined, the windows arranged with studied restraint. This continuity was deliberate. Edward wanted a home that outwardly fit the expectations of Britain's highest circles, a structure conservative enough to disarm critics who saw him as a wealthy outsider. Young's additions allowed the house to present itself as an emblem of English tradition, hiding the transformation taking shape within its walls. Inside, however, the architect unleashed a completely different vision. Guided by both the Maharaja's earlier dream and Edward's demand for grandeur, Young elevated the Indian-inspired interiors to a level of craftsmanship that surpassed the original intent. Every surface became part of a coherent aesthetic narrative that stretched across rooms and floors. Carved arches multiplied in complexity, forming layered vistas that invited the eye deeper into the space. Ceilings rose into domes patterned with gilded motifs, catching the light in shimmering halos that created a sense of perpetual dawn. Rooms expanded, not only in size but in emotional impact, their proportions recalibrated to induce wonder the moment a visitor stepped inside. It was as if the architect had captured a fragment of a distant palace and let it unfurl freely through the corridors of an English estate. The blending of styles did not result in conflict. Instead, it produced a surreal harmony. the rigid exterior, grounded in local tradition, opened into an interior world that felt transported from another continent entirely. This experiential contrast became the estate's defining feature, making it impossible for visitors to anticipate what awaited them past the threshold. The building no longer behaved like a house shaped by its location. It behaved like a story, one with twists, revelations, and deliberate contradictions that guided perception. Each room became an act in a grand performance, each arch a transition between worlds, each ornamental flourish a reminder of cultural memories that had crossed oceans to take root in Suffolk. As construction progressed, the atmosphere around the estate began to shift. Workers, craftsmen, and visitors sensed that something rare was emerging. This was not simply opulence for its own sake. It was architectural storytelling executed on a monumental scale. The marriage of subtle English facades with lavish Mughal-inspired interiors defied categorization, standing apart from anything built in Britain before or since. Guests who later walked through the completed spaces described feeling as though reality had momentarily bent, offering them entry into a dream that existed only within these walls. Elveden was no longer merely a country house. It was an illusion made solid, a fantasy carved from stone, a deliberate act of reinvention that lifted the estate out of the realm of domestic architecture and into legend. By the time Young's work neared completion, the transformation was undeniable. The house that had once struggled to reconcile two identities now embraced them fully, presenting a unified vision that transcended its origins. It became a place where imagination overruled geography, where ambition overruled convention, and where the past of one man and the future of another collided to create something neither could have accomplished alone. Elveden stood renewed, reborn into a marvel both foreign and familiar, and its halls were now ready for the spectacle, influence, and power they had been designed to host. The moment the central hall began to rise, the entire estate shifted its center of gravity. What had once been a curious blend of English restraint and Indian ornamentation was now anchored by a space so vast and luminous that it seemed to defy the logic of a private residence. The hall grew upward like a marble cathedral, its dome stretching to a height comparable to a 7-story building, swallowing anyone who entered in a scale normally reserved for empires, not individuals. Light poured in from hidden sources, scattering across white stone, polished to a cold radiance, turning every surface into a mirror that reflected both grandeur and expectation. The house no longer whispered of ambition. It announced it. The creation of this hall required an undertaking unlike anything England had seen in domestic architecture. Hundreds of tons of marble had to be quarried, transported, and cut with precision, each block selected for purity and consistency. 700 craftsmen were brought in to carve ornaments by hand, shaping petals, geometric curls, and rhythmic patterns that flowed across the surfaces with a unity that suggested one great, unending gesture. No machine could imitate the quiet humanity embedded in these carvings. Each curve carried the touch of a person who spent days, sometimes weeks, perfecting a single detail. The hall became a monument not only to wealth, but to labor, an accumulation of individual efforts merging into one monumental expression. Walking into the completed space felt like stepping into a different dimension. The acoustics transformed even the softest voice into a floating echo that seemed to circle the dome before gently disappearing. Columns rose like translucent pillars of ice, their fluted surfaces catching the light in vertical ripples. Marble balustrades produced intricate shadows on the floor below, creating shifting lace-like patterns that changed with the angle of the sun. It was a controlled spectacle, engineered to humble guests the instant they crossed the threshold. The hall demanded a posture of awe. Even the most poised aristocrats found themselves pausing mid-step, recalibrating their sense of proportion. This room did more than impress. It revealed the philosophy that guided the estate's evolution. The plain brick exterior was a mask deliberately worn to blend into English respectability, while the interior unfurled into a display of unlimited ambition. The contrast between outside and inside was no accident. Edward Guinness wanted a structure that signaled modesty from afar, only to overwhelm visitors once inside, leaving them with the unmistakable sense that they had entered a domain shaped by a different order of power. The marble hall became the purest expression of this duality, an inner world that dwarfed the expectations established by the facade, yet beneath the brilliance, the hall carried a subtle tension. It was a room built for crowds, for ceremonies, for moments when the world would gather beneath its dome. Its size, its acoustics, its design, all hinted at constant motion and activity. But when it stood empty, a strange stillness filled the space. The echoes that once danced joyfully along the walls now settled into a quieter, more contemplative rhythm. Without the presence of guests or the rustle of fabrics, the hall felt almost too large for the human world, as if it had been carved for giants who never arrived. As time went on, this stillness grew more pronounced. The marble remained luminous, the carvings remained sharp, the dome continued to filter light with immaculate precision, but the room seemed to hold its breath. It waited for footsteps, for voices, for life to fill the space again. The hall had been created to beat like the heart of the estate, sending energy through every corridor. And for a time, it did. It pulsed with activity, radiating influence and spectacle. But a structure so immense cannot remain neutral when motion fades. Quiet settles more deeply, shadows stretch farther, and the echoes become softer, as if retreating into the stone itself. The heart of the giant had begun to slow. It did not fail or crumble. It simply entered a different rhythm, one marked not by celebration, but by anticipation. It stood in perfect condition, magnificent and unmoving, as if waiting for someone capable of rekindling the purpose for which it had been designed. The hall's silence was not a void, it was a pause, and that pause would soon carry the house into a new, more complex chapter, where grandeur and emptiness would coexist in ways no one had foreseen. Elveden's transformation into a grand stage became fully evident once the extensions were complete. The house no longer functioned as a private dwelling, but as an elaborate network of spaces engineered to guide, entertain, and impress large gatherings. The drawing rooms unfolded like a series of tableaux, each designed with specific social rituals in mind. Some rooms encouraged intimate conversation under warm lamplight, while others offered sweeping views of the grounds to accompany diplomatic exchanges or moments of royal leisure. None of these spaces felt accidental. Every angle, every piece of furniture, every doorway seemed positioned to direct movement and focus, as though the architecture itself had learned to anticipate the behaviors of its distinguished guests. The library added another layer to this architectural choreography. Far larger than a private collection required, it resembled a sanctuary for minds accustomed to strategy and governance. Shelves climbed toward high ceilings, filled with volumes meant to impress and reassure visitors of the host's intellectual authority. Thick carpets softened footsteps, creating an atmosphere in which conversations could unfold without interruption. Even the placement of armchairs signaled the house's purpose, arranged to encourage debate, negotiation, or reflection during moments between formal events. It was a room that asked to be occupied, that expected discussions carrying the weight of decisions affecting far more than the boundaries of the estate. Corridors tied the building together like arteries, transporting guests and staff along paths carefully hidden from one another. Some were illuminated and lavish, guiding attendees toward the grand rooms where they were meant to be seen. Others were narrow, discreet, and meticulously planned to allow servants to appear and vanish with near-invisible efficiency. This dual circulation created the illusion that events sustained themselves effortlessly, as if the house possessed its own internal intelligence. In truth, it relied on a vast human presence, hundreds of people moving, coordinating, preparing, and maintaining the illusion of seamless hospitality. The true brilliance of Elveden lay in this balance between spectacle and invisibility. It was designed to hold large groups without ever feeling overcrowded, to host ceremonies without revealing the machinery behind them, to present luxury without the appearance of labor. During its most active years, the house came alive in ways that mirrored its architectural intentions. Music drifted through the halls, silk and velvet brushed against polished wood, and conversations layered over one another like the shifting murmur of an audience waiting for a performance to begin. Royalty found comfort in its rooms, politicians found opportunity, and society found yet another reason to gather under its luminous dome. But this design carried an inherent vulnerability. A house built for multitudes begins to suffer when those multitudes disappear. Its scale becomes disproportionate to daily life. Its enormous rooms feel too quiet, and its corridors stretch too far without footsteps to animate them. The spaces that once vibrated with energy begin to amplify silence instead. Without guests moving through the halls, the architecture loses part of its function, like a grand instrument waiting for musicians who no longer arrive. This dependency on human presence planted a question deep within the estate's future. For all its magnificence, what would happen to a structure engineered for constant celebration once the gatherings dwindled? How would a house designed to manage crowds respond to the gentle pressures of ordinary life? And what kind of atmosphere would settle over rooms built not for a family, but for an entire social world? Those answers would emerge not gradually, but through a dramatic shift in the rhythm of history, one that would test every corner of the estate and reveal the consequences of building a home that needed an audience to feel alive. The first tremor that unsettled Elveden came not from within its walls, but from the world beyond the estate. When the Great War erupted, the rhythms that had sustained the house for years were suddenly interrupted. Young gamekeepers, footmen, gardeners, and attendants, people who had kept the vast machinery of hospitality running, left the estate in uniform. Their absence carried more weight than any structural change. The corridors that once pulsed with movement began to stretch into long, quiet passages, and the halls that had echoed with conversation now amplified the faintest whisper of wind pressing against the windows. A house designed for gatherings struggled against a silence it had never been built to contain. During these years, the estate still stood in perfect condition, yet something essential had shifted. The grand marble hall, while as radiant as ever, no longer welcomed visitors who would marvel at its scale. The drawing rooms retained their splendor, but their carefully arranged furniture seemed to sit in suspended animation, waiting for occupants who never arrived. Even the hunting grounds, once alive with activity, grew still. The war had redirected the energies of an entire nation, and Elveden, built for an age of leisure and spectacle, found itself out of sync with a world consumed by conflict and uncertainty. Then came a more personal blow. Adelaide, whose presence had given warmth and intention to the estate, passed from the world, leaving behind a void no architecture could disguise. She had understood the subtle choreography of hospitality, the need for light at the right hour, the arrangement of guests, the atmosphere that turned Elveden from a structure into a living environment. Without her, the house lost the emotional anchor that had balanced Edward's relentless ambition. Rooms that had once radiated elegance now felt distinctly colder, unable to recover the intimacy her influence had provided. Edward, surrounded by the scale of the home he had built to impress the world, found himself moving through spaces that no longer reflected triumph, but isolation. The marble dome that once amplified the lively sounds of gatherings now magnified the solitary echo of his footsteps. The vastness of the architecture, once a source of pride, became a daily reminder of how far the estate had drifted from its intended purpose. A house meant for hundreds now hosted a single figure navigating hallways designed to guide crowds. The mismatch between scale and reality grew sharper with every passing season. The absence of people revealed an unsettling truth about Elveden. Grandeur without humanity becomes weight. The substance of the marble hall, its cold surfaces, its towering arches, its perfection carved by countless hands, began to feel less like a symbol of achievement and more like a monument to a chapter that could no longer be revived. The estate still stood strong, but the life inside it had thinned to a whisper. Even the sunlight entering through high windows seemed hesitant, illuminating dust motes instead of evening gowns, polished boots, or gloved hands. As Edward continued to reside within the house, the structure around him gradually shifted in character. What had once been a vibrant stage transformed into a quiet, contemplative cavern. The estate did not decline physically. It remained meticulously maintained, but it grew emotionally distant, as though preparing itself for a long period of slumber. The energy that once coursed through its halls faded into something more subdued, a steady pulse instead of a powerful rhythm. By the time Edward's own chapter drew to a close, Elveden had already begun its transformation into something entirely different from what either he or the Maharaja had imagined. It no longer felt like a palace of influence or a monument to memory. Instead, it became a giant caught in contemplation, standing perfectly still while the outside world continued to evolve. The house had not lost its grandeur, but its grandeur had lost its audience. And in that quiet, in the vastness that now felt almost deserted, the estate discovered the identity that would define the next stage of its existence. It began, slowly and inevitably, to withdraw from the world, not out of decay, but out of a growing understanding that it had been built for a time that no longer existed. Elveden was becoming what it would remain for decades to come, a magnificent silent giant waiting for someone who could once again give purpose to its towering halls. When the estate passed into the hands of the next Guinness generation, the house confronted expectations it had never been designed to meet. Rupert Guinness and his wife Gwendolyn approached Elveden not as a stage for spectacle, but as a responsibility, a legacy demanding practical purpose in a world that had begun to question the value of grand estates. They attempted to reinterpret the house through a modern lens, shifting its emphasis from lavish gatherings to a more grounded, service-oriented life. Yet the building resisted these efforts with an almost physical force. Every corridor, every hall, every towering arch reminded them that Elveden had been created for magnitude, not intimacy, for ceremony rather than domestic comfort. Their intentions were earnest. Rupert focused on agriculture, investing in the land with scientific discipline and transforming the surrounding acreage into a productive enterprise. Gwendolyn, engaged in public life, carried a sense of duty that seemed well matched to the estate's heritage. They approached Elveden with the mindset of stewards rather than performers, hoping to align the house with the realities of the changing 20th century. But the architecture, grand and uncompromising, constantly pushed back against attempts to reduce its form to something manageable. Even in moments of familial warmth, the rooms felt too cavernous, too formal, too aware of their original purpose to accommodate simple domestic rhythms. It was not neglect that created this tension. It was design. The drawing rooms were too large for everyday gatherings, built to impress crowds rather than host quiet evenings. The vast dining spaces echoed uncomfortably without dozens of voices to fill them. Bedrooms designed for visiting dignitaries felt impersonal when used as family quarters. The hallways, engineered for coordinated movement of staff and guests, seemed excessive when only a handful of people occupied the house. Elveden had been imagined as an environment of performance and hierarchy. And when those elements faded, its scale revealed itself as an obstacle to ordinary living. The house wanted to be a palace, and a palace cannot easily become a home. Despite their affection for the estate, Rupert and Gwendolyn sensed this disconnect. They adapted as best they could, redirecting their energy to the land where work felt purposeful and the results tangible. Outside the house, the fields flourished, responding to innovation with a vigor that contrasted sharply with the heavy, ceremonial atmosphere indoors. Inside, the rooms remained frozen in their grand proportions, waiting for guests who no longer arrived. The estate functioned, but the heart of the giant remained quiet, as if observing the efforts of its new stewards with polite detachment. As the years passed, global tensions began to rise once again. The approach of another conflict cast a shadow over the estate, amplifying the divide between Elveden's intended purpose and the new reality taking shape. The house, already too large for a family and too elaborate for daily life, now faced the possibility of being drafted into a role neither the Maharaja nor Edward Guinness could ever have predicted. Its architecture, so magnificent in times of peace, began to resemble a relic from an era rapidly slipping away. The tension in the air grew heavier as Britain prepared for a second global crisis. The estate felt the shift even before any official decision was made. The grand halls, which once carried the energy of aristocratic gatherings, now seemed to brace themselves for an entirely different kind of occupation. The silence deepened, not with loneliness this time, but with anticipation, as though the house understood that its vastness, once a burden, was about to become a resource. And with the onset of the new war, Elveden's path veered sharply, leaving behind the pursuit of domesticity and returning to a scale of purpose more aligned with its true nature, though, in a way, none of its creators had ever imagined. When the Second World War engulfed Europe, Elveden's vastness, once an inconvenience for daily living, became its greatest asset. The estate was requisitioned for military use, and in a transformation that would have seemed impossible only a few decades earlier, the marble halls and Indian-inspired chambers filled with the purposeful motion of the United States Army Air Forces. Officers marched beneath domes originally meant to evoke the grandeur of Mughal palaces, their boots striking rhythms against Italian marble floors carved by artisans thousands of miles away. The juxtaposition was startling, the architecture of empire now serving the machinery of global conflict. The Grand Hall, conceived as a space for royal receptions and glittering gatherings, took on an entirely new life. Long tables replaced banqueting arrangements, maps spread across surfaces once designed for decorative displays, and the air filled with the low, determined murmur of strategic discussions. Beneath arches originally carved to celebrate the cultural memory of a distant land, military planners coordinated missions that stretched across the European theater. Radios crackled where orchestras once played. Officers hurried past the same columns that had once framed elegant evening attire. The room absorbed it all, its acoustics reshaping the sounds of war into echoes that rose toward the dome before dissolving into the air. Other parts of the estate underwent similar transformations. The drawing rooms became makeshift offices, their ornate panels and imported furnishings now backdrop to clipped conversations and tense briefings. Rooms designed for aristocratic leisure held communication equipment and logistical maps marked with pins and strings. Even the private chambers, once intended to impress visiting nobles, served practical wartime purposes, their luxury overshadowed by the urgency of military operation. For the first time, the house functioned with the constant movement it had been built to support, but the energy that now filled it bore no resemblance to its intended elegance. When the war ended and the soldiers departed, the silence that returned to Elveden was deeper than any it had known before. The estate had absorbed years of intense activity, and its sudden stillness felt like a shock. The halls, stripped of their wartime purpose, stood quiet and strangely hollow. The grand spaces which had once held orchestras and diplomatic conversations now held the memory of briefings and strategic decisions. The contrast made their emptiness feel heavier, as if the house itself were trying to adjust to a world that no longer required its scale. The practical realities of post-war Britain added another layer of difficulty. Taxes soared, the workforce that had once maintained large estates diminished, and the cultural appetite for aristocratic grandeur waned. Elveden, with its immense size and intricate interiors, demanded a level of upkeep that no longer aligned with the new era, heating the vast rooms, caring for the acres of marble, preserving the carved details. All of it required resources that were no longer reasonable for a private household. The estate's magnificence, once a source of pride, now risked becoming an unsustainable burden. In this new landscape, the house seemed to drift further from modern life. Its architecture, tied to ambitions from another century, felt increasingly out of step with contemporary needs. The very qualities that had made Elveden extraordinary, its scale, its hybrid identity, its theatrical presence, rendered it incompatible with the modest, practical sensibilities that shaped post-war Britain. What had been a marvel became a question. What place could a palace like this have in a world moving toward efficiency and simplicity? The giant stood intact, but felt more distant than ever, its splendor outliving the era that had justified it. And as the estate faced decisions about its future, the weight of its size and the complexity of its identity raised an unsettling possibility that its next chapter might require not occupation, but abandonment. With the war behind them and the pressures of a changing nation closing in, the Guinness family confronted a reality that no amount of sentiment or pride could soften. Elveden, magnificent as it was, had become impossible to inhabit in the traditional sense. Its rooms, built for royal entourages and grand receptions, now felt out of proportion with the quieter, more practical rhythms of the post-war world. The cost of maintaining such a structure, its marble floors, soaring ceilings, intricate carvings, and endless corridors, rose each year, while the cultural appetite for such monumental homes diminished. Faced with the choice of demolition, modernization, or preservation, the family made a decision that defied the era's expectations. They chose to close the house rather than alter or erase it. The act of sealing Elveden was not a retreat, but a form of guardianship. Shutters were drawn across the tall windows, protecting delicate interiors from sunlight. Heavy drapes were tied back and carefully wrapped to prevent decay. Water was turned off, fireplaces cleaned one final time, and doors locked in a sequence that transformed the estate from a living residence into a dormant monument. Furniture remained exactly where it had stood during the final years of habitation, covered in linen to shield it from dust. Bookshelves stayed filled, dishes stayed stacked. Even small personal touches, a vase, a writing desk, a coat in a side room, remained undisturbed. The family preserved not only the structure, but the essence of the world that had once animated it. As the decades progressed, the stillness inside Elveden deepened into something almost sacred. Dust settled lightly on surfaces, but never seemed to accumulate. The house felt suspended in a kind of perfect equilibrium, where time slowed rather than advanced. The marble hall, once reverberating with orchestral notes and military commands, now held only the gentle sound of its own vastness. The drawing rooms, corridors, and grand staircases existed in a state that resembled expectation rather than decline, as if they were waiting for a signal to wake again. The architecture remained intact, because nothing intruded upon it. Silence became both protector and companion. Outside, the estate continued to evolve under Rupert and later his successor. But the main house stood apart from this activity, untouched by the modernizations happening around it. Fields were cultivated, machinery moved across the land, and new agricultural practices took root, yet the mansion remained a sealed world, an island of history preserved with remarkable continuity. Local residents speculated about the interior, building myths around its frozen grandeur, tales of untouched dining tables, pristine libraries, and staircases untouched by footsteps for a generation. These stories, while embellished, were grounded in a striking truth. Few houses in Britain remained so completely preserved, so faithfully protected from both decay and modernization. The longer the house remained closed, the more its identity shifted. It became less a residence and more a memory in physical form, a grand relic holding the atmosphere of an earlier century. Its silence was not abandonment, but preservations carried out with unwavering discipline. For 40 years, Elveden existed as a sleeping giant, hidden behind its facade, untouched by casual visitors, and held in a state so rare that even historic estates with public funding struggled to replicate it. The house was not displayed, restored, or repurposed. It simply waited. That waiting created a growing sense of tension, as though the building itself recognized that such stillness could not last forever. A structure of such ambition was never meant to remain unseen indefinitely. It had been built for spectacle, for presence, for participation in the social currents of its time, and even in its slumber, it radiated a quiet insistence that it would one day re-enter the world. The moment when Elveden would finally be unlocked, revealing the preserved echoes of its past, approached slowly but inevitably. After decades of silence, the world beyond the gates began to take an interest once again. The sealed rooms, the untouched interiors, the whispered legends, all of it created a sense of anticipation that stretched across years. And in the spring of the 1980s, the doors that had remained shut for nearly half a century finally opened, inviting the world to see what had been kept in the dark for so long. When the doors of Elveden finally swung open in 1984, it was not for a royal arrival or a grand celebration, but for something far more unusual: a public auction. For the first time in living memory, the world was invited to cross the threshold of a house that had been held in stasis for 40 years. Crowds flooded the long drive, forming lines that wound through the grounds as if they were approaching a long-lost monument. What awaited them inside felt almost unreal. Every room, every hallway, every object appeared suspended in a moment from the 1930s, as though the occupants had stepped out for an afternoon stroll and simply never returned. Visitors wandered through rooms where newspapers lay folded on tables, where wardrobes still held coats shaped by the silhouettes of their former owners, where the faint scent of old paper drifted from books left untouched for decades. The marble hall, brilliant as the day it was completed, greeted them with a stillness that carried the weight of its long sleep. Lamps covered in linen, silverware wrapped in cloth, curtains drawn to preserve the colors of tapestries. Each detail reinforced the impression that time had paused in this place rather than moved forward. Some described the experience as stepping into a private time capsule. Others compared it to entering a beautifully preserved dream. The auction that followed became a national event. More than 2,000 items were cataloged, displayed, and sold, everything from furniture and artwork to rugs, porcelain, and household tools. As the auctioneer's hammer fell again and again, the interior world that had remained intact for so long gradually dissolved. Pieces that once belonged to the unified identity of the house embarked on new journeys, dispersed across the country and beyond. With each item removed, Elveden shed another layer of its past, leaving behind a structure that stood empty but strangely purified, no longer burdened by the carefully preserved remnants of a bygone era. Yet, emptiness did not mean decline. Instead, the stripped house revealed a character powerful enough to inspire a new kind of life. Its cavernous marble hall, sweeping staircases, and exotic architectural blend caught the attention of filmmakers, searching for settings that could evoke grandeur, secrecy, or otherworldly elegance. Soon, the estate became one of Britain's most distinctive filming locations. Stanley Kubrick used its surreal interiors to frame scenes of hidden rituals and elite gatherings in Eyes Wide Shut. The house appeared again in Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, offering a backdrop that felt both ancient and strangely futuristic. Even modern period dramas turned to Elveden, recognizing that its halls could convincingly stand in for palaces far from England. With each production, the house stepped briefly back into the spotlight, fulfilling its original purpose in a new, unexpected way. It no longer hosted monarchs or aristocrats, but actors and crews who brought temporary bursts of activity into spaces once meant for spectacle. The cameras loved Elveden's contradictions, its cold marble gleam, its vast emptiness, its ability to transform into places it was never meant to represent. The estate's identity as a sleeping giant shifted into something more symbolic, a monument that lived through illusion rather than daily life. Meanwhile, under the stewardship of the 4th Earl of Iveagh, efforts began to preserve and stabilize the building itself. Restoration projects addressed the roof, protected the stonework, and ensured that the magnificent structure would endure for generations to come. The surrounding farmland thrived, evolving into one of the most productive agricultural operations in the country. Yet the house, despite these efforts, remained uninhabited. Its rooms stood clean and secure, but devoid of the warmth of domestic existence. Even in restoration, Elveden preserved the aura of a place held slightly outside the normal flow of time. Today, the estate stands as a rare architectural paradox, a house too magnificent to demolish, too impractical to live in, and too compelling to ignore. Its marble hall gleams as brightly as ever, but the echoes within it belong to crews, cameras, and occasional visitors rather than the elite gatherings it was designed to host. The building endures not through the lives of its residents, but through the stories projected onto it, cinematic, historical, and imagined. In this strange afterlife, Elveden has achieved a kind of immortality. Its name circulates in film credits, architectural studies, and whispered conversations among those fascinated by forgotten palaces. But the immortality it holds is quiet, static, and undeniably solitary. The giant stands awake but alone, admired yet unclaimed, a testament to ambition that outpaced the human world around it. The dreams that shaped it, the Maharaja's longing, Edward Guinness's strategy, echo faintly through its empty halls, and as long as the structure endures, those echoes will continue, reflecting the legacy of those who built a palace that could never truly belong to any single era or purpose. Elveden lives on, majestic and distant, a reminder that grand visions can indeed outlast their creators, but often at the price of living forever in a world that no longer knows how to inhabit them.